From Appoint Productions and WUWM, this is Classic Eats. I'm Kyle Johnson Cherek. For this episode of Classic Eats, we seek to answer the question, why French? I'm joined by author David Kamp. David has written articles for Vanity Fair, the Wall Street Journal magazine, The Atlantic, the New York Times, and the New Yorker, among many others. He's also collaborated on memoirs with Ron Howard, Chris Blackwell, Rob Reiner, and Patrick Stewart, and many more. In 2006, David wrote a book called The United States of Arugula that explored how we in America became a gourmet nation. It's David Kamp answering the question, why French? On this episode of Classic Eats. But first, a story. It's 1939 and you have already spent 1/3 of your life in some of the better kitchens of Paris. At times, brutal as they were, you know this is your soul's calling. Coming from the small Burgundian town of Venimere, your family nickname had been La Gourmande for as long as you can remember. Riding in third class on the ocean liner bound for New York, you had no idea what was in store for you. Though you left Paris as a cook, nay, the assistant to the saucier at a restaurant owned by a French family so well respected and connected that they won the right to run the 400-seat French culinary pavilion at the World's Fair of 1939. How could you know that you, in the space of 2 decades, would be the irreplaceable capstone in the culinary arch that carried all the zhuzh, refinement, ingredient erudition, and francophile gleam of French cooking to American dinner plates, cookbooks, and palates? In retrospect, it seems almost fitting that you would be the one, plucked from the scores of the kitchen brigade to be sent to a place called Flushing Meadows, Queens. After all, you had worked your way up from a tender age, spending hours hunched over vegetables, peeling them precisely. Now, sailing from France to New York to prepare for what would amount to no less than a Gaelic culinary beachhead in America, the Pavilion, as it was called at the World's Fair, was a resounding hit, and its Restaurant Française did such business as to make the other exhibitions jealous. These Americans come from far and wide, you thought, and know nothing of the subtle nuance of tarragon, the shivering flavor bank of aspic, or seductive loose of soufflés. How could anyone, even you, know that the Restaurant Française would give birth to the preeminent French restaurant in New York and moreover America in the 1950s, Le Pavillon? And as executive chef of Le Pavillon, how could you know that your menu would inspire a young Jackie Kennedy to hire your colleague, French chef René Verdon, to be the first French chef for the White House? Or that you would end up giving Jacques Pepin his first job in America, starting a trajectory that would catapult him into being a household name? Who could have guessed that this cook in third class would be the other side of the coin to Julia Child's French chef, publishing his own recipes week after week in the New York Times as the 60-Minute Gourmet for over 20 years? Who knew, Chef Pierre Farnay, that as the decades marched forward, only the most history-minded of foodies would know your name? Though without you building up flavors and all things French in the kitchen, America's love affair with all Francophile food across the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s would have been just a tepid romance. That's the story of acclaimed French chef Pierre Farnay. This is a show about culinary history, why we eat what we eat, the people, the places, the scenes and situations that set the course for the way we dine. Each show, we pick a thing, a person, a drink, a movement, or an object that made its mark on what we call food. Today, we're speaking with author David Kamp to answer the question, why French?
My name is David Kamp. I'm a writer and author. Among my books is The United States of Arugula.
Well, Good to see you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
It's a delight to be here.
You don't just write about food. Tell me some of the other things you've written about.
I mean, I guess I'm a polyglot, if that's not too self-celebratory. Right across culture. I write about music. Food is something that's always been my private passion, what I most enjoy thinking about off duty. And so for the purposes of the book, The United States of Arugula, I thought, I was writing a book I couldn't find on the shelves of a bookstore or library. I wanted someone to synthesize all the threads of how America went from being a land of like Wonder Bread and iceberg lettuce to, in the course of my lifetime anyway, to being a land where things like arugula and artisanal breads and much, much more became not just fashionable, but commonplace.
How did America end up with French as the preeminent cuisine? And I'm curious, I know I've read your book and things like that, but when you look at the lens of America through population, through immigration, through things like that, we don't have a lot of French folks coming over here.
Sure.
Or coming down from Canada. We don't have a heavy French influence with the exception of their help in the Revolutionary War. And after that, we just sort of, went our separate ways. Then we paid them back in World War I and World War II. But how did it become the preeminent cuisine of America to the point where when the Kennedys came into the White House, there was no question that someone like René Verdun, their French chef, would come in and be the chef at the nation's, home.
Right. Well, that's a good starting point because if you go back to the end of World War II, that was kind of the great period of French ascendancy culinarily in the United States, basically 1945 to the Kennedys moving into the White House. And it was because of that sense of post-war exuberance and prosperity, the emergence of a genuine middle class with disposable income, which was truly a new phenomenon. People don't realize that how suddenly the middle class became a more widespread thing, as did dining out. We always had diners and taverns, but the concept of fine dining, going out for a nice dinner with your spouse or your family in a white tablecloth restaurant and ordering a bottle of wine, the only people who really did that before World War II were rich people.
We were kind of a caste society before World War II. Not an unspoken one, but there was very much the working class, and then there were the Rockefellers of the world.
Well, there wasn't a concept of event dining or fine dining, and this is where France comes in, because when World War II ends, there's a few factors in play here, Kyle. One is that there's a GI Bill, which allows GIs to study and pursue jobs and career paths that give them the disposable income to pursue food as a hobby more.
Yeah. Buy homes as an avenue to wealth, things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And another thing is actually that GIs who actually saw France and experienced France and fell in love with the cuisine and the culture. So as you say, there isn't a huge Franco-American population to begin with. Now, I'm not talking about the Chef Boyardee can. I'm talking about French Americans.
I know. Yes. Yeah. I know that story.
But you had a lot of GIs who actually spent time in France and fell in love with the culture, and then sometimes fell in love with French women and married them and brought them to America. And so you had all of this, and then this Francophilia, which kind of made sense because it is kind of the mother cuisine of fine dining throughout Europe, England, Ireland, and continental Europe. The concept of the brigade, meaning the hierarchy within a kitchen, was invented by Auguste Escoffier, who was kind of this turn of the 19th into 20th century authority on French food. And so kind of the template for restaurant cooking as restaurants evolved into an affordable luxury for the middle and upper middle classes, that was set by the French.
So was this a conscious decision? Did de Gaulle and his counselors or ministers get together and say, we are now going to take over America with our food? I mean, how did this actually in practical terms happen?
What happened was nothing so mandated or designed as de Gaulle saying, we want a French takeover of American cuisine. However, there was some diplomacy afoot because it really started in 1939 and 1940 when the United States hosted the World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, Queens, New York City. And so it was a 2-year-long World's Fair. And the French decided to devote a lot of their pavilion space to what they called Restaurant Français, which is simply a French restaurant showcasing, the sophisticated cuisine that they had to offer. And the guy tapped to oversee that was the manager of a restaurant in Paris named Henri Soulet, a stout little man who looked like a French Alfred Hitchcock. Very snobby, unbearable guy in some ways, but he was a visionary.
Straight out of central casting for
exactly,
the French.
He was.
Maitre d'.
And he was a snob, and he looked down on people, even though he looked like a character actor, all that stuff.
Apparently looking up at people, looking down at people, as you described him.
A wee man, but a wee man in height, if not in girth. Soulet tapped a young guy named Pierre Frenet to be the kind of the head kitchen guy there. And this thing was a sensation. Like, people were turned on by the electrified palate-wise by the amazingness of French cuisine in America. Again, mostly more sophisticated people, but it was a World's Fair. So you had people of all classes experiencing it. But it was so successful, this French pavilion restaurant, that a bunch of rich Americans, the class that were still the only ones going out for fine dining, decided to be investors and say to Henri Soulet, hey, there's a war on back home anyway, why don't you stay here and we'll finance a restaurant, which he, of course, called Le Pavillon, after the French pavilion at the World's Fair. And
Keep it simple. Yeah.
Le Pavillon became the first French fine dining restaurant in New York City. There had previously been French restaurants, but they're more like humble bistros that served the west side of Manhattan, where cruise ships came in. So you had a lot of people, French people, who worked on cruise ships. And so it was, again, sort of more of an ethnic enclave idea.
Right.
Le Pavillon changed everything because suddenly the rich swells were going out to dinner at this first-rate French restaurant.
Well, and it was in the, if I recall from your book, it was on the Upper East Side, which is where that crowd lived. So this was in a different way, a bit of a neighborhood restaurant. So they opened up a restaurant with their own money for themselves in a way. Would that be accurate?
That would be accurate. And indeed, I think Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, was both a customer and a bankroller of Le Pavillon. And then Soulet is so successful with Le Pavillon, he opens a second restaurant called La Côte Basque. And then as a lot of his employees get fed up with Henri Soulet, because he was an unbearable boss, in addition to being an incorrigible snob, they fanned out, and this is when we get the era of what we call the Le and La restaurants. So suddenly the East 50s and 60s are dotted with like La Caravelle and Le Périgord and La Grenouille. And so suddenly you have this constellation of restaurants opened by former acolytes or employees of Henri Soulet.
If you're just joining us for this episode of Classic Eats, we explore the question, why French? And my guest is author, lyricist, and humorist, David Kamp. So that's the Upper East Side of New York and the Kennedys and the Don Drapers of the world and so forth. But with all affection to you in New York, who I know you're a New Yorker, it's a world unto itself.
Indeed, yes.
How does it then transfer to St. Cloud, Minnesota and Missoula, Montana? And is it all because of Julia Child? Or how do we become, by the end of the 60s, if you stopped an average American, they would know that French food was accessible, fancy food. How do we get there?
I would say Julia Child is the biggest factor, but not the only factor. But I'll start with her. So Julia Child grew up in a sort of well-to-do clubby family in Southern California. She came from a country club world where everyone ate that very bland club food. And only during World War II, she was, considered a spinster because she didn't marry until she was, nearly 40. She marries this great guy named Paul Child who worked for the Office of Special Services, the OSS, a precursor to the CIA. In any event, while in France, both during the war and post-war, Julia, like again, was one of these people whose palate was turned on by French food. She was not someone who grew up appreciating food as a passion. This happened to her basically around age 40. And so she gets really into it, so into it that she starts taking cooking classes. And bear in mind how the kitchen brigade in the old days was all men. Like it was seen, a woman's place was in the home for cooking domestically for the family. But in terms of professional kitchens and serious cooking, that was considered a man's sphere. Julia Child was a woman who had the audacity to say, I want to learn how to cook this way too. So she did, and became so good at it and so passionate about it that while in Paris, she founded a cooking school with two female colleagues. And then from that, with those two women, she started collaborating on this book which would end up being called Mastering the Art of French Cooking.
Which is an American icon. And we all
Right.
know the story there, because if you have a pulse and do anything more than eat Pop-Tarts, you probably have a copy on your shelf or have a relative that has a copy.
Right. And so that book came out in 1961. And it was almost 10 years in the making. It had a lot of false starts, but also a lot of thorough vetting and research, which is why those recipes still hold up to this day. And so that book comes out. It gets a lot of coverage by another important person, Craig Claiborne, in the New York Times. He was the first guy at a major paper, even though it was a New York paper, it had national reach. First guy to both review restaurants in a serious way and to kind of disseminate food as journalism, telling the stories of the people behind the food.
So I know before that, food journalism was kind of regulated to the home economics portion of newspapers around America. Really, no one had ever really reviewed restaurants before?
It was only these pieces in Gourmet that were written almost like society columns in this very stylized, snooty prose. There was one of the guys who wrote these columns. His name was literally Lucius Beebe. So I mean, it was intended for an audience of
the town and country set
of town and country people and rubberneckers who wanted to see how the other half lived.
Got it.
Craig Claiborne kind of democratized that. He was from a sort of fairly poor family in Mississippi, but he just loved food, and he said, why should this just be for an affluent readership? And as in that post-war period when dining out became more of an affordable luxury for the middle class, he said, I think it would be a useful service for me to actually review restaurants, just like theater critics review plays and movie critics review movies. And so he started doing that, and not only doing that, but also interviewing chefs and proficient home cooks about how and why they did what they did. So essentially elevating food people from the kitchen to, the front page of the food section.
So would it be fair to say that everybody that's on TV right now, from the Great British Baking Show contestants that win to the late Anthony Bourdain and everyone in between, owes their career in some way to Craig Claiborne?
Craig Claiborne and Julia Child.
And Julia Child.
Because I'll get back to Julia. So 1961 is when that book comes out. It's already a major hit. 2 years later, in 1963, The French Chef, her public TV show on WGBH in Boston, is circulated nationwide, and it becomes almost instantly a national hit. And they would do several seasons of it into the 1970s. And she was just so charismatic in her off-kilter way. But the other important thing beyond like Julia Child being a wacky personality with the fluttery voice and the jokey mannerisms is that she made aspirational Americans realize that you don't have to be French. You don't have to have French ingredients.
Wonderful recipes today on The French Chef.
You can go to your local supermarket, your A&P, your Wegmans, what have you, and buy ingredients that maybe aren't exactly what they have in France.
What a key aspect.
I'm going to show you how to put them to use and put your pots and pans to use so you can actually create bona fide quality French food.
Okay, so we've got Farnay and Soleil coming over, and the World's Fair of 1939. We've got GIs coming in, and a lot of people don't realize it when they think about it, but with the European theater, of course, most of the time they spent was in France. So that engagement, and then coming over and having a burgeoning middle class. And then we have the Craig Claibornes of the world. And I'm sorry, we have the Lays of the Laws in New York expanding, and the Craig Claibornes of the world writing about food in a more serious, thoughtful, contemplative, and accessible way. And then we have Julia Child's just stardom and accessibility.
Yes, we have already established that Henri Soulé, though he was a restaurant visionary, was a bit of a difficult man, and a lot of people had fallings out with him. Not a lot of people left his restaurant on good terms. And so Pierre Fernet, who would also, by the way, later pair up with Craig Claiborne to publish recipes in the New York Times food section. But Pierre Fernet was Soulé's head chef at Le Pavillon. Pierre, and one of his deputies that he brings over is a very young Jacques Pepin, who had actually worked as the personal chef for Charles de Gaulle, and at age 19 or something like that.
So back to my story about de Gaulle and his ministers getting together. So there is a conspiracy.
Pierre Fernet, who went on to work with Craig Claiborne at the New York Times, and Jacques Pepin, who went on to become Jacques Pepin.
Right. And Claiborne and I think Fernet and of course Jacques Pepin all had television shows and multiple cookbooks and appearances and things like that. I mean, they had their own famous cooking careers in their own right, just beyond someone's restaurant or chain of restaurants.
Right. And the idea of the alliance between Claiborne and Fernet is really important because, even though the New York Times is a New York paper, it had nationwide reach. And they started doing recipes together that were weeknight recipes. They were called a 60-minute gourmet, wherein Claiborne wrote while Fernet did the actual cooking of how you can prepare a quality dinner, a quality entree in 60 minutes. Like you get home from work, you got 60 minutes. That's not such a long time to spend for a payoff of a great dinner.
Well, this has been, you are unequivocally the expert on this. This has been really just so fantastic is the best word I can come up with, and enlightening to understand the story of why French, because it's changed the way Americans think of food, and in my opinion made way for a lot of the other ethnic cuisines of Italian and Spanish and Chinese and so on and so forth. If we hadn't had that first acceptance of this, as you said, aspirational food, I think it would be a lot more boring in this country to have a meal.
And that's the whole thing, that people like Julia Child and Craig Claiborne inspired aspiration. It wasn't snobby, even though our associations of the French, including your accent, are of snobby people. It was the idea that, hey, good things are available to you. You can do it. We believe in you. It's not just for these fancy people. It's available to every American.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thanks for joining us as we explored Why French on Classic Eats. Special thanks to author David Kamp. Next episode, we continue to plumb the depths of Why French with acclaimed chef Gavin Kaysen. Thanks for taking a seat at our table for this episode of Classic Eats.
Classic Eats is created and hosted by Kyle Johnson Cherek and co-produced by Apuan Productions and WUWM.
Executive producers Kyle Johnson Cherek and Rob Schoonover. Audio editing and engineering by Brian Arkta and John Rymaszewski.
Thanks for taking a seat at the table with Classic Eats. You can hear this episode again and any others you've missed when you subscribe to Classic Eats, found wherever you listen to your podcasts.